Sam Harris is one of those guys that was apparently this high-minded intellectual that's definitely not a conservative. It's something different. The intellectual dark web. Just kidding. The reality of Sam Harris is that he was one of these new atheists who Bill Maher would have on all the time, who spoke about how religion was very dangerous and...
particularly Islam.
In the end, you look at the analysis and much of it was about how really it's these Muslim savages in the Middle East that are the threat to polite Western society, and not other religions, just the ones that we can associate with the war on terror, basically. And it doesn't need to be an analysis about U.S. colonialism or Western interference in the region and exploitation and oil and war. It can just be about the inherent debauchery, the inherent evil of Islam and of the Muslim faith. And so he's been kind of a Trump critic recently. Speaking of that IDW split, he's been criticizing Trump getting some cachet back with liberals. But this was from his podcast episode recently, a reminder that Sam Harris, despite not liking Trump, is still one of the most hateful Islamophobic bigots in media right now.
The overwhelming majority of people who are this confused about how to live good lives are Islamic extremists, and the worst of these are jihadists. Now, Hamas is a jihadist organization. In my view, that's all we need to know about it. The question of how it got that way is fundamentally uninteresting.
Pause.
As is the question of why so many Palestinians have come to support it.
This is why... Okay, I just want to take this piecemeal. Why is it uninteresting to you to talk about the origins of Hamas, Sam Harris? Because it would undercut everything you're saying?
Yeah, because the context actually tells you everything you need to know. Why does a colonial resistance group form? Why does it resort to terrorism? Like, these things are all actually have been studied even beyond the Israel-Palestine experience.
It's just also just a very anti-materialist take, obviously. And it's the kind of thing that I think appeals to, like, you know, very middle-brow thinkers who presume themselves to be very intelligent, that they would think, of course, because Islam is something different. It's something that exists outside of like traditional historical and material, cause and effect. It's something that just like makes your brain rot out. But like that's completely ridiculous, obviously. And he would not accept that kind of, and I think go back to your earlier point about like the distinctions that they make between Islam and other, even Abrahamic religions. Like they would never cast Christians who probably exist in their communities with that same light. They wouldn't say like, it doesn't matter.
Right. And they've done this before, by the way. It's kind of an evolution from just traditional racism where you saw it, honestly, in the way that black people were talked about in this country, where it's like, well, I mean, where are the fathers? What's wrong with the values that they're teaching? And it's just kind of a way to be like, black people are inferior. Now it's not just Muslim people they're not civilized inherently. It's what's being taught to them in their ideology.
Well, I mean, that's a great point, Emma, because when we saw racism as defined by, or at least like vocal racism defined by like just the argument that black people are inherently naturally inferior, become unpopular, we saw so much more, so many more like right-wing thinkers like shift to that, it's black culture. It's not natural. Mm-hmm. It's black culture. And it's something that black culture, you're not even supposed to examine it in the context of like, well, what gave rise to black culture? Is it like white supremacist American culture? Is that a big sort of bedrock of like black culture in America? Maybe, maybe not. But that shouldn't be taken into account when you're talking about like why black people believe the things that they believe, why they participate in society. And, that's just now being adapted to like Islam as a general term for like, I guess, Arab culture. Basically. Because they definitely mean Arab people. They don't mean like, when they think of Muslims, they don't think of like all of the Asian Muslims in parts of the Indonesia, but they think of like Arab people.
Exactly. All right.
That's all we need to know about it. The question of how it got that way is fundamentally uninteresting.
I'm sure.
As is the question of why so many Palestinians have come to support it. It would be like asking in 1941 how the SS became so radicalized. And why do so many millions of Germans support it? That's an interesting question now.
Yeah, pause it.
Right now that Nazism has been...
Why would you not want to examine that?
Right.
Why would you not want to examine that? That is an interesting question. It's actually really important.
It's also important to like start like trying to figure that stuff out as it's happening. History isn't just something that we do in hindsight to talk about the past. Like understanding the contemporary socio-political and other factors that led to the rise of Nazism as it's happening concurrently is important, because a lot of times once it's over, there's a lot of revisionist history that is painted for a lot of these things. Like a lot of Nazism gets blamed entirely on like lower class Germans, for example, when we know, especially from writings at the time, that there was a lot of support amongst the more upwardly mobile middle class Germans of the time. It wasn't simply just like it wasn't like totally lower class rebellion, take over the country. The petite bourgeoisie were very involved in it.
Yeah, I mean, and abstracting the Holocaust from history is extremely dangerous. We've been saying this as it relates to, this 6 months of Israel's genocide for a while now, because Netanyahu has spread conspiracy theories that it was actually the Palestinian Grand Mufti who gave Hitler the idea to exterminate the Jews. And then you hear Sam Harris saying this exact kind of same thing. We'll keep playing it, but saying that Hamas and jihadists generally are worse than the Nazis. I mean, I think that is basically a denial of the conditions that led to the Holocaust, because you should be examining that this was a fascist, far-right, nationalistic political movement that occurred within historical and political context and didn't just come out of, like, say, some random ideology. These are all powerful and power structures that led to the rise of Nazis, and they're not too far away from the ones that still exist today. I mean, not saying that is exactly that's going to happen, but the point is just like it's less than 100 years old, and it's not like we fundamentally remade society in a way that we don't have these kind of far right demagogues anymore. Nazism and far right movements exist throughout the world, but abstracting them from history means you don't have to analyze the power structures that led to it. And you can make these crazy claims like Sam Harris does here.
Support it. That's an interesting question now, right now that Nazism has been defeated. But in 1941, there was nothing to do but kill Nazis. I feel exactly the same way about jihadists. In fact, jihadists are worse than Nazis, in my view. They don't have the same power the Nazis had in the 30s and 40s, which is a very good thing, and we should keep it that way. But their ideology is actually worse.
All right, pause it again.
Jihadists.
I'm sorry.
Wow. That's something else. I mean, just to your point before we listen to more of that, Emma, that's one of the main purposes of like extricating the Holocaust and World War II and the atrocities committed by the Germans during that time from history, from modernity, from like any contemporary analysis, because then you don't have to examine all of the component characteristics that existed in their society and existed globally that gave rise to it, that could continue to exist to this day. You can just pretend like it was an anomaly. It wasn't an atrocity committed by the Western world. And that's why you can say things like, oh, Islamic jihadists are actually worse than the Nazis because their culture is giving rise to this hatred. But that's not what happened with the Nazis in Germany. It was something different. It wasn't Western culture giving rise to this sort of thing. It wasn't the anti-Semitism and the colonialism and the sort of just widespread fascism that existed at the time in one form or another. It was just an anomaly, which is different than Islamicism or whatever, which is just like it's like that's all their culture is. That's all their culture can give rise to. It's very insidious.
It's really insidious, and what you do is lay conditions for history to repeat itself when you aren't explicit about this, and when you say that the fact that Nazis that had more power is irrelevant to our condemnation of them as a political movement. I mean, the whole problem with the Nazis is that they had power. It's not this isn't some sort of you're a bad guy, I'm a good guy, I'm a civilized smart person, you're a dumb brown person analysis. I mean, this is just for children.
Well, it's purely ideological.
Yeah.
We've moved from any sort of material or historical considerations into who has the worst brain and whose brain is doing the worst thing. And that is a fundamentally misanthropic and elitist position. And that's what Sam Harris is here for.
And in the end, it's racist too. I mean, because why would you be absolving? Yeah.
No, it's also fucked up to be like, sorry, cursing, but it's also messed up to say like, oh, the Nazis are gone. That's why we can analyze them critically now. And also the Nazis aren't that bad. You know who's really bad? Brown people. Yep. Like that's his analysis. At the same time, he's saying Nazis don't exist. He's also saying they're not so bad, not as bad as like degenerate Muslims. Like, yeah, it's wild.
It's analogous to what Douglas Murray said after he watched the tape from October 7th, like the unedited footage from October 7th. That basically he wrote an op-ed afterwards where he was like, even Nazis like drank themselves to sleep to like forget all of the atrocities that they committed. They were racked with guilt about what they were doing in the concentration camps. Somehow, in the effort to say how bad Hamas is and how evil Hamas is, it's also somehow in some way implicitly obviating or at least slightly absolving what the Nazis did in the Holocaust.
Yeah.
I mean, the jump to just bringing up the Nazis too is a tell there. Like, why even bring them up?
Okay.
Why
I'll also just make a note, like, don't fucking give Richard Hanania any attention. Don't quote tweet him. Leave that little Nazi roach, like, to die in obscurity. People need to not be shocked by the Nazi doing Nazi things on Twitter and quote tweeting it. But anyway, here we go.
But their ideology is actually worse. Jihadism is essentially Nazism plus an expectation of paradise. It's
Pure
Nazism
ideology.
plus religious fanaticism. Nazism plus an eagerness to be martyred and to see their children martyred. There are many differences between Nazism and jihadism, of course, but they only make the Nazis look comparatively benign.
Oh my God.
Nazism was a quasi-religious phenomenon.
Nazi apologism.
These people were not rationalists. It was basically racist mysticism anchored to a cult of personality. But the Nazis didn't use their own women and children as human shields.
This is him. So that's just basically saying that the jihadists want you to kill their children.
Yep.
And also that the Nazis weren't so bad, apparently. That's what I learned today from Sam Harris's podcast. Didn't he used to just do like Zen meditation or something? I feel like
him and Russell Brand. They meditated their way towards minimizing the Nazis compared to Hamas. There's a couple things I want to play here. One is this Indian diplomat here talking with, I forget this guy, Karan Thapar, who does really great interviews. And this is just him talking. This is how diplomats talk about, this is not like far leftists. This is not, some sort of like extremist group. This is ambassadors. This is how ambassadors talk about terrorism, who aren't like cowed by Israel.
Now, yesterday, Mr. Emmer, Israel announced what it called an extraordinary listing of Lashkar-e-Taiba as a terrorist organization. India has so far not listed Hamas as a terrorist organization, but the Israeli ambassador has made clear to Indian journalists that Israel has formally asked India to do this. If India does take that step, perhaps in response to what Israel has taken yesterday, how will it be viewed in Riyadh, in Cairo, in Abu Dhabi, in Amman?
India has suffered terrorist violence from Lashkar-e-Taiba from 1989 to 1990. That is for nearly 35 years. I never heard the Israelis say anything in that regard over all these decades. And now suddenly, opportunistically, because they want India to take a tough public posture and declare Hamas as a terrorist organization, they have done this with regard to Lashkar-e-Taiba. I think both actions, this Israeli action, declaring Lashkar-e-Taiba as a terrorist organization and our declaring Hamas as a terrorist organization are really meaningless. They serve no useful purpose. We are not involved. We are not engaged. We are, as far as Hamas is concerned, we have had no engagement with them as an organization. We have never taken a public position and therefore we've never described said, to call Hamas at this moment a terrorist organization, to my mind, would be a travesty. Hamas is a political entity and it has participated in elections. The reason why you find the Palestine Authority so feeble today is because the Palestine Authority itself, led by Mahmoud Abbas, Israel, and the United States are terrified that if you had free and fair elections in the West Bank and Gaza, the Hamas would win. It would win hands down. That is why we have not had elections from 2011 till today, and you have Mahmoud Abbas in position, elected for 5 years, now in place for the last 15 or 20 years. Therefore, it is also a militant organization, it has a militant part. It is a resistance movement. It is a resistance movement in line with numerous resistance movements that you have found in occupied territories. Indeed, in our own country as well. We have therefore, as I have said, and I'm going to repeat my cliche, that terrorism, like beauty, lies in the eyes of the beholder. And therefore, academia has moved away. We don't use the word terrorism, we use the word violent extremism. And that is a neutral term. Terrorism is a term used by governments that are attacked by resistance fighters, and very often we stigmatize them as terrorists. That is neither here. As far as India is concerned, labeling Hamas as a terrorist.
That's it.
That's
Sorry, that was a little bit fast.
That was that's half the speed that Matt normally listens to this stuff anyway.
But the point is just obvious to anyone who isn't getting all of their news from basically media organizations that haven't wrestle with the fact that Zionism and Zionists and Israel lie about this stuff all the time and use these sort of terms like terrorist as propaganda. If we have time, I also have another clip of Sam Harris. This is recently, maybe, I don't know if you can see the date there, but probably within the last month or so, on the Decoding the Gurus podcast. And here it is, if you're at 55, Bradley, and they talk about, this is a great podcast, very, I think, fair, not leftist, but they put this to Sam Harris, how are you talking about the religious fundamentalism on one side and ignoring it on the other? And I think Sam Harris's response is interesting.
In the Israeli government, who had a poster on the wall of a terrorist, and want Netanyahu kind of supporting the increasing settlement movement and courting the far right, the religious right. So my kind of point there is, if you present that conflict as being, purely about the forces of civilization versus like a religious fanatical cult, and don't mention that there is a fanatical religious cult that is in the government of Israel and has made various statements which are similarly talking about the promised land and reclaiming it, that it seems like you're being selective. And it doesn't mean that you have to say they're both equal in that respect. You can still completely condemn Hamas and all the things. You can still argue that Israel has a right to defend itself, but it doesn't require serving as their kind of propaganda wing, because lots of Israelis were very unhappy with Netanyahu and his government. It is a very right-wing government. And the last thing I'll say, and I'll give you a chance to respond, Sam, is the ex-Israeli prime minister who was assassinated, Rabin, he wasn't assassinated by Islamic extremists. Yeah. He was assassinated by a Jewish extremist who derailed the peace negotiations that were going on, and the legacy of which was that Netanyahu, who was in opposition to Rabin, ended up in power. So the history over there is very complex in that, but I'm arguing, isn't there a case that the presentation yourself and Douglas Murray have done kind of whitewashes those concerns, which are legitimate?
No. I mean, I raise those points a fair amount. It's just in proportion to the problem on the Islamic side, they're quite small. I mean, they're very unhelpful. I would fully grant to you that Netanyahu has been a disaster. His support for the settlements has been provocative. He's to some degree culpable for what happened on October 7th, if for no other reason that his attention was split, and he was propping up the settlements in the West Bank and leaving the border with Gaza, fairly undefended, right? So. But all the mad work that the settlers are doing in the West Bank, and the religious extremists who support them, all of that is incredibly unhelpful, and I don't support it at all. And I've said in other contexts, I thought that the settlers should be dragged off contested land by their beards, right? I mean, that's not optically a great thing to say in the aftermath of October 7th, but I'm Jewish and I can say whatever I want on the topic. I think those people are religious imbeciles, and they're creating immense harm, right? And they're imagining claims upon.
why doesn't the state of Israel act like it? Why does it instead act like actually they're part of the plan here? That's a simple question. But Sam Harris, history only matters when it's time to, bomb Gaza for October 7th. Now you get out of, we don't need to talk about the ideology of the Israelis or in the settlers. We don't need to, that stuff's irrelevant because that stuff's only actually relevant to these people when they want to demonize somebody that's getting bombed. No, that's it.
All right. Well, that was fun to see him a little bit uncomfortable there.
But that is the solution to the West Bank. I'm sorry, like, not dragged off by the beards, but like there has to be some sort of expulsion that's probably not going to be, and I'm not saying by like just violence, but the international community needs to say, you need to go.
Yeah.
These houses belong to the right of return. All that stuff, there's going to be violent resistance if that ever came to pass by Israelis. And there needs to be defense against actually doing what's right, which is to end the occupation, full right of return. Like, these actually are things that need to be confronted. And we've left it till this. Instead of confronting actually this stuff, we've left it until the violence continues to spurt out because there's actually no military or like fencing solution. Even if Netanyahu had the fence of Gaza being guarded and wasn't supporting the settlers, like that's not really a solution.
Also, he's totally talking out of both sides of his mouth there by going, he literally says back to back, oh, you know, the religious extremists in Israel are very small. It's not that big of a problem. But October 7th happened because Netanyahu was distracted by what was going on with the religious.
Right.
I mean, what?
Brandon from Kentucky. I'd like to see Sam Harris explain how rational and not extremist the Third Temple is in Israel among Jewish extremists. Excavating under Al-Aqsa Mosque so it will collapse. Netanyahu literally held a press conference under the mosque as a way of bragging about destroying it. I did not even know that.
Sam Harris's legit position is that stuff is less important because Palestinians do suicide bombing sometimes.
And now they're going to sacrifice 4 red heifers. Is it heifers? Heifers, yeah. Without any white hair.
Not a country girl, Emma.
Yeah. Well, I thought I'd heard heifers in relation to like women.
Right, of course.
But I didn't know if I should say it. So I was like, which way could I go? All right. Anyway, definitely not a country girl. June from El Paso says, shout out to Matt's pinata analogy. Shit was fire.
That's one of my favorites, frankly. A lot of pinatas out there.
Mike in Philly said, did Sam Harris just call Nazism rational?
I think you call it pseudo-rational, but more rational than Hamas, I think.
I think he was saying it's pseudo-religious, but that it wasn't
pseudo-religious.
Quasi.
I mean, half of the things that he was saying about like Nazism and Nazi Germany, I was like, clearly he doesn't know anything about Nazism and Nazi Germany, because pseudo-religious is putting it mildly. But again, like he's just like, this is just racism, you know. Arabs are how he's coding Islam.
He said what were one of the things he said? Oh, he said something like that stuck out to me. It was that you know, jihadists are trying to create a paradise for themselves, and it's like, wait, but like it's literally why the Nazis were expelling people from the country. Like, yeah.
And I mean, what is Israel doing? They're literally saying we have a right to this land because of like the Bible and our, you know, genes from 2,000 years ago, and I want to create this ethnic state paradise. It's all
literally taking land and houses from.
What about Christian evangelicals who are literally supporting Israel's right to do a genocide because they think that Jewish people need to be in Israel for Jesus Christ to literally come back to the earth to like then kill all of them, like, I don't know, like at the Ark of the Covenant style. Like, I mean, come on. I think if anything, the people who are most engaged with their material circumstances are the Palestinians in this circumstance. The rest of them, you know, Israel as well, but evangelicals are just going off pure just religious zealotry.